you have, on the one hand, two forces. There is a long established Islamist movement, which has a demonstrated organization and capability to conduct strategically meaningful violence, kidnapping, assassination, general intimidation, as well as potentially occasional gruesome public displays of violence. The UK cities, many of which are essentially semi-feral already.
Tell me a little bit about studying war and the Civil War aspects of it. What would a civil war look like in modern UK?
Right. So, well, studying war, yes, you can study war. There's a long-standing, the UK is home to the War Studies Department, which is a long-standing academic institution, relatively unique in the world, but fairly large and well-respected. And I've been part of that for about 25 years now. My area of specialism really is foreign wars, because that's been the preoccupation of, most Britons about war for all of this time. I'm particularly a specialist on irregular warfare, insurgency, and related elements of that. And about, I guess, approximately 8 years, and in which role I'd written very widely, a number of books, many articles. I've advised governments, including the British, American, and others over the years on these subjects. And my interest in this originated probably about 8 years ago, perhaps a little bit longer, when I began to recognize in our own government, in our own forms of governance, aspects of what the literature on insurgency and counterinsurgency would suggest is a country that is in a significant crisis of legitimacy, which is fundamentally what drives in internal conflict. What would it look like in the UK? Well, probably the best way of getting at this really is you have to understand the way in the study of classical insurgency, probably the most well-known version of that is derived from the thoughts and writing of Mao Zedong. And so when people talk about classical insurgency, they are usually referring to a three-phase model that was first articulated by Mao. The first phase is the defensive. This is a phase in which the insurgents are very weak relative to the state, and they're mostly involved in political organization, in propagandization. They're not typically doing attacks, but if they are, they are a very low level. The second phase is usually described as the stalemate, and that's where the insurgency begins to break the surface. You see attacks occurring, but they are in the nature of hit and run attacks, ambushes, the like. There's still heavy political organization going on. So there is a kind of revolutionary violence bubbling up, but it is not yet a conventional symmetric sort of conflict. The third phase is essentially a conventional symmetric conflict in which looks a lot like a normal war. Many civil wars in the past have concluded in favor of the insurgent without having proceeded to a full-blown phase 3. Equally, some have jumped from normal politics directly to phase 3 in one go. The American Civil War of the mid-19th century would be an example of that. In the case at hand, I think two issues are highly pertinent. Firstly, scenarios of a full-blown phase 3 symmetrical civil war are very implausible in the case of Britain, on account of the fact that the fissures in British society don't align with geographically politically defined identities. The legitimacy of the British government, of the central government, will decline to zero long before any such identities solidify and acquire a competitive state-like character. So I don't expect that. Secondly, the threat to existing authority is sharply bifurcated. You have, on the one hand, two forces. There is a long-established Islamist movement, which has a demonstrated organization and capability to conduct strategically meaningful violence, but it has little mass potential on account of the fact that its conscience community is a minority within British society. On the other hand, there is the emerging nativist movement. It's not the best term for it, but it is probably the one we have to go for at the moment. So you have this emerging nativist movement, which is currently very ill organized, has little demonstrated violent capability, despite how much it is talked about, but it has significant mass potential on account of its appeal to the ideals of the titular nationality, i.e. of the majority population. So I think if you take this into account, or look at this from the government's point of view, the government's efforts to contain and to mitigate the threat of Islamist terrorism includes measures like intrusive surveillance, target hardening of the broader civil milieu, so, bollards around Christmas markets and on bridges and the like, that people recognize. These are costly, they're frequently irksome, they are increasingly perceived as injurious to people's civil liberty, their expectations of privacy, and so on. Similarly, the government's efforts to co-opt, or at least not to further inflame the Muslim population, give charges in the broader society, give substance rather to charges within the broader society of the existence of two-tier policing and generally unequal application of the law. These things are very damaging to civil comity, to perception of legitimacy, and so on. So in effect, the government now is stuck in a series of interlocking traps that are social in origin, that are aggravated by economic exigency, or stringency, and out of which the government cannot extricate itself in respect of one category of threat without aggravating its difficulties in respect of the other. In terms of the frame outlined above, I think that the Islamist threat is probably close to the limit of its potential in British society, somewhere towards the lower part of phase 2. Whereas the nativist threat is somewhere in the middle of phase 1 at a fraction of its actual potential. The character of the Civil War that is about, that I believe is likely to occur, is probably in the first instance to look something rather like the dirty wars of Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, also to some extent of parts of Europe in that period of time. Your listeners may recognize the term "the years of lead," which was the phrase used to describe the Italian experience of this. And here we have a conflict which features widespread but long-term, low-grade attacks, typically in the shape of tit-for-tat, kidnapping, assassination, general intimidation, as well as potentially occasional gruesome public displays of violence, like the dangling of corpses from highways, highway overpasses, and the like, which has been fairly typical of Mexican cartels. As dreadful as that will be, it's not the most worrisome worrisome strategy that will be employed, in my view. And finally, I'll just come to the end here, which are probably a fairly long explication, but I am coming to the end. I think the strategy that anti-status quo groups are going to gravitate towards ultimately will be to use infrastructural attack on the life support systems of the major cities with a view to causing cascading crises, sustained and widespread power outages, interruptions of the gas supply, disruption of the mass transit and the like, with the hope of causing a set of cascading crises leading to systemic failure and a period ultimately of mass chaos in which there is substantial population movement, which can be harnessed towards a significant alteration of the status quo. The plausible application of this strategy should not be dismissed. This is what I urge people to understand. There's nothing in what I have just said that is particularly controversial or difficult from a tactical point of view, or that is not perfectly well understood and described in open literature. It aligns with the conclusions that have been drawn by people in urban studies about the tenuous balance of the urban condition under normal circumstances. And it's certainly an idea which has been significantly and persistently discussed within anti-status quo circles for at least the last 10 years since I have been following it. Fundamentally, the cities, the UK cities, many of which are essentially semi-feral already in terms of, I use a term derived again from the military literature, in that case, an essay from the United States in the early 2000s describing something called the feral city, which is a city that is fundamentally ungoverned. And there are many aspects of many British cities, it must be said, not only British cities, which already are at least giving warning signs on the ferality scale. So that's essentially what I think it is going to look like. Firstly, something a bit like Dirty Wars, but metastasizing into a larger and more dramatic development, chiefly through the use of infrastructural attack on the life support systems of the major cities, which will have significant effect.